Thank you. Go ahead, Ryan.
Hi, thank you all for having me here. I'm the one non-local. I came with my green scissors. You gotta have props. At Taxpayers for Common Sense, we believe that taxes are the dues we pay to be part of a democracy. We're not trying to fight for necessarily a smaller government or necessarily a larger government, but we believe that as the taxpayers, we have a right and a duty to demand excellence from government. We don't think there's ever a time where it's excusable for the government to be wasting our hard-earned tax dollars. We all work incredibly hard. We want the best from our democracy. We have an amazing country, and we deserve the best from the government. But as such, we've got to be vigilant. Our approach to Taxpayers for Common Sense is that we look for things that I always say, they're not that controversial outside of the Beltway. In the Beltway, they're often very controversial, but when you get outside of the Beltway, a lot of the things we work on follow common sense principles that we think of as, these are just not ways that we can afford to be allocating our tax dollars. I want to talk a little bit about the types of cuts we're talking about in Green Scissors. These are direct subsidies, so money that goes out the door from the government in a check or a wire transfer. Tax expenditures, which are provisions that are in permanent tax law that basically give a privilege to specific industries or specific companies. So they function like spending, but they are basically foregone revenue. There are some people in Washington who would consider getting rid of a tax expenditure to be a tax increase. We just consider it getting rid of wasteful spending. It's just on the tax side of the ledger. We have loan guarantees and other financing mechanisms in here, which are basically putting the full faith and credit of the United States government behind different operations. One thing we can get into greater detail on the loan guarantee programs that are in Taxpayers for Common Sense. We look at them across the government, and one thing about them that's just tricky is that they're super attractive to Congress, because something happens in Congress that when you propose something, it goes to the Congressional Budget Office to get scored, and loan guarantees get scored as almost nothing. So it looks like free money. But we take the hit if there's a loss. So we always look at those with a great deal of skepticism to make sure that we're looking out for the best interests of the taxpayers. We look at liability caps as a subsidy, so that, for example, oil spills, offshore oil spills are capped at $75 million. If you have an offshore oil spill, it's capped at $75 million, so that's your responsibility. BP, looking like $6 billion right now. Price-Anderson, a liability cap for the nuclear power industry. I don't even want to think about it's horrible to even kind of quantify what the Fukushima disaster is costing, but we can be pretty sure that is going to be in the dozens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. So we think of those as advantages given to certain industries so that they don't have to carry the full cost of their doing business. We look at insurance, like crop insurance and flood insurance, which we think as things that encourage irresponsible behavior that wouldn't necessarily take place if people didn't think that they had a safety net in place. And then different kinds of revenue raisers. There's tax expenditures, but there's also things like collecting royalties. One of my kind of pet peeve subsidies is the 1872 mining law, which literally requires the federal government to sell land at no more than $5 an acre in the West, and allows people to mine gold, not kidding, gold and other minerals on federal lands and pay not a dime in royalties. There's not a single person who said, I've got about 20 acres here, why don't you come and take the gold and not give me any money? And I'll be responsible for the cleanup. There's just nobody, there's not a single private landowner in the world who would behave that way. And we have behaved that way since 1872, when we put that law in place to help populate the West and get that industry going. I think the industry is going now. So that's the category of things that we're calling spending that can be cut in the Green Scissors report. I think it's a balanced set of issues. I would agree with a lot of, with Ross that we need a balanced approach as we look at this deficit and debt problem. And then I think the other thing to just kind of point out is, I've been saying this a lot lately, and when you repeat things, you realize, do I actually agree with that? And on this one, I really do. There's actually no agreement in Washington on what the problem is at all. There's no agreement between the chambers. There's very little agreement among the parties. The day after we got the deal on the debt ceiling, the headlines were, we immediately have to start doing job creation, when they just passed a law that says, well, now you have to do another $1.5 trillion in deficit reduction. So it's this moment of incredible disagreement. That said, we have a super committee, and they're going to make some cuts. And I'm pretty sure they're going to try to do that to avoid the triggers that are in place, because the triggers are seen as both politically very painful and in fact very painful, because they'd be significant cuts to defense as well as revenue raisers. I want to talk a little bit as a kind of segue into questions about how the Green Scissors Reports comes to be. We've been doing Green Scissors Reports for 16 years with Friends of the Earth, who's kind of one of the primary core partners on this. This year, the 4 core partners are Friends of the Earth, a progressive environmental organization. Just as an example, they were the farthest left major environmental organization last year on the climate bill. They didn't think it went far enough. They were the most critical of it as making too many deals with too many industries. Public Citizen, which was founded by Ralph Nader and is a long-standing consumer advocate in Washington. The Heartland Institute, which is based in Chicago. It's a free market think tank that puts on the biggest conference every year saying basically climate change is not a real problem that we need to address right now. So if you can get Friends of the Earth and the Heartland Institute to agree on $380 billion of spending that they see as harmful to the environment, that's a feat. We worked hard to do this. It's like any other organizing. It's all about sitting down at the table and going through things. Does this meet our standard of, for Friends of the Earth, does it harm the environment? For Heartland, is it interrupting the marketplace and bad for the business? And for taxpayers, it's, are we making a bad deal for taxpayers? For Public Citizens, it's are consumers being harmed by this? You don't have to agree with every report in here, but getting a bunch of groups and interest groups that really disagree on, that have fundamentally opposing missions in some cases, to agree on something is a process that I think we need to follow as we look ahead. This is, we just have to make some decisions through Congress. Congress needs to hear from voters that it actually matters what they do in this super committee. Another thing I keep thinking about in this, from the whole public opinion on Congress right now, is at record lows. And that's one of those things where you're like, really? You could have gone lower? I didn't know that. But record lows that people think the debt ceiling debate made everybody just discouraged about what government was doing for them. And, you look at the members of the super committee, including Senator Murray, these are very experienced legislators. A lot of them have special interests that they have worked very closely with over the years, who they defend, who they protect, who they make sure get a lot of money, because they believe in them. I'm willing to even give everybody the best interest at heart. But to get moving, to show Americans that we can make decisions that make sense as a country, we need them to kind of set aside some of their past special interests and make decisions for all of us.
Thank you. And now I'll direct this to Andy first, I think. In response really to what Ryan is talking about, are there core principles from the Green Scissors process that could be adapted to guide the supercommittee's work? And are there other principles that we should consider when approaching deficit reduction on this scale?
Well, I think the 3 main points that I started off with are a good place. I'd say if I wanted to distill those into a set of principles that I would give to the super committee, I would say, as I said, we need a balanced approach and a long-term approach to deficit reduction that includes significant amounts of revenues, either through, getting rid of special tax breaks or through allowing some or all of the Bush tax cuts to expire. We also need to protect programs for low-income Americans, that these are an integral part of our economy, that they benefit the economy very broadly, not just the populations they directly serve, that they benefit our communities, and that's just a very core principle that I think the committee needs to take. One very deep principle, I think, is that they not undermine Medicaid, that Medicaid is a very important program. It plays a very significant counter-cyclical role, that during recessions, the recession would be far deeper and worse if it were not for these dollars that are put into states and into local communities to help low-income families pay for their medical expenses. And finally, I think we need to avoid further discretionary cuts. That the things that are on the table would severely weaken defense. They would severely weaken Medicare or Medicaid. And to wrap it back up, that I do think that revenue and particularly tax expenditures, like we're talking about here today, absolutely have to be part of the solution that we ultimately come up with.
So let me just follow up just a bit. So it's your position that this type of method for reaching consensus won't work on a larger scale, that they have to also consider increasing revenue by way of taxes?
Well, they can consider revenue. The super committee, everything is on the table. The cuts the trigger cuts that will go into place are pretty much all cuts in Medicare and defense. But the super committee can propose an alternative path, and the better path, we would argue, is one that at least half of which includes revenues from getting rid of these kind of special tax expenditures or tax breaks that we're talking about. A really rigorous look at which ones are not productive, like we're talking about here today. And I do think some rate increases, particularly allowing the Bush tax cuts to expire, are something that can play an integral role in the long-term debt problem and the shorter-term deficit issue.
Okay, thank you. And Ross, what about you? Do you think there's core principles from this green scissors approach that could be adopted by the super committee and applied on a larger scale?
Sure. I think the one thing that Ryan mentioned broadly that we strongly agree with is you need to be looking at all of these different kinds of expenditures on the same metric and analyzing them all severely. As you mentioned, there's been a tendency to look at loan guarantees or liability relief or provisions of giving away public goods like the royalty provisions on a different level than direct expenditures. And that shouldn't be the case. You need to be analyzing all these things closely, and we strongly agree with that. Many of these subsidies are written so deeply into the tax code, into accounting practices, into royalty provisions, that you really have to apply the kind of rigorous analysis that this report starts with, and we applaud that. I'd also echo something that Paul said. There is no reason that we should be subsidizing ongoing profitable activities, and certainly shouldn't be subsidizing the most profitable corporations that have ever existed in the history of capital. That just doesn't make sense. And, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to find ways to specifically incentivize and support the kinds of things that we need to have, whether it's ways to help the least fortunate in our economy and preserve our economy or create essential safety nets there, or whether it's supporting the things that we're concerned about, which are the kinds of industries, the kind of community activities that are going to allow us to move away from fossil fuels towards a just and equitable transition to clean energy.
Okay, thank you. And Paul, do you want to add to this?
Sure. I guess I'll pick up on what you just said, is that it sounds like you're saying that you like some subsidies, but you don't like other subsidies. So my point of view would be, why have any subsidies? Why should the government, I'll put it this way, I don't think it's fair for powerful government officials to pick winners and losers in the marketplace, where they say, we have decided that your industry is going to receive a subsidy because we like you, or you're politically influential, and this other industry over here is not. I think the government should play the role of a fair umpire or referee in our society, and shouldn't be saying that the fad of the moment tells us that this is the future of technology or clean energy in our society, but this other technology is not. And we've seen the problem that's happened with biofuels, and Todd Myers on our staff has written a book called Eco-Fads, in which he lists again and again society has been taken up with fashionable ideas which are translated into public policy, which cost billions of dollars in either subsidies or tax supports, and then later on it's found that those policies are actually hurting the environment instead of helping the environment. The mistake comes from when politicians think that they can substitute their judgment. They're going to predict that biofuels is the wave of the future. Then after 5 years, they discover that all that money was wasted, and it's actually consuming more land and water and resources and not helping the environment. So then they shift to something else. The problem is that I don't think public officials will ever know what new technology will help us in the future. Hybrids themselves came from the private marketplace in terms of research. Electric technology is not, well, you could debate with different technologies, but my point is that public officials are not good at making these choices, whereas real people in the marketplace are good at making those choices, and in fact the Prius is a good example of that. It is encouraging, and I think that there's more courage than you would expect among members from rural states. And one example I would give you is Congressman Army from Texas, who's now retired, but for years, he opposed agricultural subsidies of all kinds and introduced bills to reduce the crop subsidy program to zero, even though he was from an agricultural state. He didn't suffer politically for that. In fact, he was admired for his principled position. So I think a lot of congressmen, members of the super committee, even Patty Murray, who's from Washington State, one recommendation I would make to her is reduce agricultural subsidies, even though you're from an agricultural state.